The air in Terminal 9 smelled like ozone, unwashed exoflesh, and the slow, inevitable decay of a space station that had long outlived its structural warranty. I stood in a line that stretched across the docking bay like a multicolored snake of pure, unadulterated misery. It was the kind of line where hope went to die and get recycled into low-grade nutrient paste. I shifted my weight, trying to ignore the way my duffel bag strap was attempting to saw through my shoulder bone. Inside that bag were the tools of my trade: harmonic calibrators, plasma wrenches, and a half-eaten protein bar that was probably the most valuable thing I owned. I was just an engineer, a structural harmonizer, if you wanted the fancy title the Terra Standard Union put on my contract. In plain English, I fixed things that people were too stupid to keep from breaking. Next in line, a massive crustacean-like being with pincers the size of my head clicked impatiently. The sound made my teeth ache. I took a deep breath of the recycled air, which tasted faintly of recycled farts, and stared at the purple neon signs flickering above the immigration booths. "Welcome to the fringe, Kalen. Try not to get eaten." The immigration officer was a six-eyed bureaucrat who looked like he'd been carved out of a piece of wet leather. Each eye blinked in a different rhythm, a dizzying display of boredom that only a government employee could master. I stepped forward and placed my Terra Standard Identification Locus, the TSIL card, onto the scanner. "Kalen Voss," I said, my voice sounding raspy from the dry air. "Civilian engineer, level 2 clearance for the Singularity Shroud installation." One eye swiveled toward me, staring with the intensity of a dying star, while the other 5 remained glued to a holographic display. "Purpose of transit?" the officer asked, his voice a series of wet clicks. "Contract work," I replied, leaning against the counter. "The shroud has been humming at the wrong frequency. If I don't retune the dampeners, this whole sector is going to have a very bad, very explosive day. 5 months of work, maybe 6 if the plasma conduits are as crusty as the rumors say." The officer made a sound like a drain clogging. "Humans, always complaining about the hardware. You brought unauthorized biologicals?" "Just me and my winning personality," I said, patting my bag. "Nothing restricted. No seeds, no spores, no illegal moonshine." "We'll see," he grunted, waving a segmented limb toward the security belt. "Baggage on the scanner. Proceed to secondary screening for physical verification. Next." I let out a sigh that was 50% frustration and 50%, "Here we go again." In this corner of the galaxy, being human was like being the weird cousin who shows up to the family reunion uninvited and smells like cheap gasoline. We were tolerated, but only because we were cheap labor and could survive in environments that would melt most other species. I shuffled toward the secondary checkpoint, joining a line of galactic misfits. In front of me was a being with tentacles that kept reaching for the ceiling lights as if it were trying to catch imaginary flies. Behind me, something with translucent skin hummed at a frequency that made my fillings vibrate. Just another Tuesday in the void. To pass the time, I started running structural calculations in my head. If the Singularity Shroud's 4th quadrant was indeed leaking gravitons at a rate of 5.2 per microsecond, the containment field would lose integrity in approximately 340 days. Not my problem yet, but it kept the boredom at bay. Numbers were clean. People were messy, unpredictable, and usually had too many eyes. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the adjacent line, separated by a flickering energy barrier. She was humanoid, but that was where the similarity ended. Her skin was a pale, luminous lavender, traced with intricate silver patterns that pulsed faintly in time with the station's artificial heartbeat. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. She had 4 of them, 2 large silver orbs where a human's eyes would be, and 2 smaller ones positioned just above her temples. She looked tired, her head bowed as she waited for her turn. Then she glanced up. Her gaze drifted over the crowd, landing casually on the booth where my TSIL card was still being processed by a secondary scanner. Her 4 eyes widened in perfect unison. Her pupils dilated until they were nothing but bottomless silver pits. She went rigid, her mouth falling open as if she'd seen a ghost rising from the metal floor. Then she screamed. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force. It was high-pitched, resonant, and filled with a mixture of terror and absolute religious awe. Every sentient being within 50 meters ducked or reached for a concealed weapon. The guards, hulking brutes in heavy armor, leveled their shock pikes. "He's real!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the hum of the station like a serrated blade. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "The Harbinger! The one from the residue! The dreamer of the glass garden!" I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Uh, lady," I stammered, raising my hands in the universal gesture for, "Please don't shoot me. I think you've got the wrong guy. I'm just an engineer. I fix pipes. I'm very boring, I promise." But she didn't listen. She lunged forward, crashing against the energy barrier that separated the lines. Sparks flew as her bioluminescent nerve lines flared bright violet. "I have seen him every night since the first awakening." "Ah," she cried out to the stunned crowd. "His face is etched into the collective unconscious. He is the ethyl residue." The word ethyl hit the room like a thermal detonator. The guards didn't hesitate. Two of them grabbed me by the arms, their metal gauntlets bruising my skin. My TSIL card was snatched from the scanner. "Hey, watch the merchandise," I yelled, trying to struggle. "I've got a contract. I've got rights. Rights are suspended for suspected ethyl anomalies." A voice boomed from behind the security booth. A tall figure in charcoal-colored robes stepped forward. His face was a mask of cold, calculated indifference. "Identify this entity." Kalen Voss, sir," one of the guards shouted. "Terra Standard Civilian, tagged for the Singularity Shroud Project." The robed figure, who I realized was an overseer, looked at me, then at the screaming lavender woman. "She claims he is a residue, a carrier of the forbidden sequence." "I'm a carrier of a half-eaten protein bar and a bad attitude," I shouted. "Let me go. I don't even know what an ethyl is." "Secure him," the overseer commanded, ignoring my protests. "Level 4 containment. Authorization for full neural mapping and genetic deconstruction." "Deconstruction?" My voice cracked. "That sounds like something you do to a condemned building. You can't do that to a person." As the guards dragged me toward a heavy blast door, the woman fell to her knees, her 4 silver eyes weeping glowing tears. "Kalen," she called out, using my name even though I hadn't told her. "Do not let them erase the garden. Remember the promise of the Silver Sun?" The blast doors hissed shut, cutting off her voice. I was left in the grip of 2 armored giants, being hauled down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fear. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe the lavender lady was high on stardust. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to look, a memory was flickering. A memory of a place I'd never been. A garden where the trees were made of glass, and the sun shone with a gentle, silver light. "Great," I whispered to myself as the guards shoved me into a lightless cell. "First day on the job, and I'm already a religious icon for a crazy alien. This is definitely going to affect my performance bonus." The detention cell was a masterpiece of minimalist cruelty. It was a 3 by 3 meter cube of matte white composite, lit by a single overhead light that pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm designed to break a prisoner's sense of time. There were no windows, no furniture, and the air was chilled to precisely 15 degrees Celsius. Just cold enough to keep a human shivering, but not cold enough to kill them. I sat on the floor, my back against the vibrating wall, and tried to focus on my breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Structural engineering was all about load-bearing. Right now, I was the structure, and the world was trying to crush me. "Okay, Kalen," I muttered, my breath blooming in a small cloud of mist. "Think. You're a problem solver." Problem. You're being held by a group of zealots who think you're a ghost from an ancient civilization. Solution. Tell them they're idiots and hope they have a sense of humor. Or, die. Let's aim for the first one. The wall in front of me shimmered. It didn't open. It simply ceased to be solid, transforming into a field of transparent energy. On the other side stood the robed figure from the terminal, High Overseer Malachor. Up close, he looked even more like a man who had forgotten how to smile. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his eyes were cold, dark pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. "The subject remains defiant," Malachor said, his voice a dry rasp. He wasn't talking to me. He was speaking into a recording device floating near his shoulder. Cortisol levels are elevated. Typical human response to perceived threat. Perceived? I barked a laugh that sounded more like a cough. You dragged me out of an immigration line and threw me in a freezer. My threat meter is pinned in the red, buddy. Malachor stepped closer to the energy field. You are Kalen Voss, born in the Chicago habitat Terra, educated at the Polytechnical Institute. Specialization, high-energy harmonic resonance. A mediocre record, yet you were chosen for the Singularity Shroud project over 300 more qualified candidates. I blinked. Hey, I'm not mediocre. I'm unconventionally brilliant. And I got the job because I'm the only one willing to work for the credits they were offering. Most engineers don't want to spend 6 months staring at a hole in the universe. Or perhaps, Malachor countered, his voice dropping an octave, you were chosen because your genetic signature acted as a beacon, a key waiting for its lock. I don't do keys, I do wrenches, I snapped. Look, Overseer, that woman in the line, she's obviously got some loose circuits. I've never seen her before in my life. I don't know anything about ethals or residues. I'm just a guy who wants to fix some pipes and go home to his cat. The ethal were the architects of the Great Collapse, Malachor said, his eyes narrowing. They were a plague of gods who thought they could rewrite the laws of physics to suit their whims. They were purged 60 cycles ago, their technology buried, their memory erased. Or so we thought. He signaled to someone out of my line of sight. 2 technicians entered the room behind him, pushing a hovering gantry that carried a device I recognized with a jolt of pure terror. It was a Mark VII Cortex peeler, a neural mapping rig that was banned on nearly every civilized world. It didn't just read memories. It stripped them, layer by layer, often leaving the subject's brain as useful as a bowl of lukewarm soup. Whoa, whoa! I scrambled to my feet, backing against the cold wall. You can't use that. That's a violation of the Terra Galactic Accord. I've got treaty protections. Treaty protections do not apply to ethal-suspected entities, Malachor said coldly. By the authority of the Purge Council, you are classified as an existential threat to galactic stability. The procedure will begin immediately. Malachor, wait! A new figure stepped into the light. It was the lavender woman from the terminal, Vanya. She was restrained by 2 guards, her silver eyes glowing with a desperate intensity. You cannot do this. The residue is fragile. If you use the peeler, you will destroy the knowledge he carries. You will doom us all. The only thing I will doom is the ghost of a dead empire, Malachor replied. Technicians, proceed. The energy field vanished, and the guards surged into the cell. I fought, I really did. I kicked one in the shin and tried to bite another's hand. But I was an engineer, not a commando. They pinned me to the floor, my face pressed against the cold composite, while the technicians positioned the cortex peeler over my head. Listen to me, I screamed, my voice muffled by the floor. I'm just an engineer. I don't have any secrets. I barely remember my own password half the time. I felt the cold metal of the peeler's probes pressing against my temples. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through my skull. Calibrating for human neural density, a technician said, initiating primary scan. Then the world exploded. It wasn't a physical explosion. It was a burst of light and sound inside my own head. The white walls of the cell vanished, replaced by a sky of swirling indigo and gold. I was no longer on the floor. I was standing in a garden, the glass garden. The trees were tall and spindly, their branches made of translucent crystal that chimed in a wind I couldn't feel. The ground beneath my feet wasn't dirt, but a soft, glowing moss that pulsed with silver light. Above me, a sun the color of polished chrome hung in a sky filled with 3 moons. Kalen? A voice whispered. I turned. A woman was standing among the glass trees. She was Athelian, like Vanya, but her nerve lines were a brilliant, fiery gold. She looked at me with an expression of such profound love and sorrow that my heart felt like it was being squeezed by a giant hand. Eris, she said, reaching out a hand, you've come back. You've brought the anchor. I'm not Eris, I stammered, my head spinning. I'm Kalen. I fix things. I shouldn't be here. The time is short, the woman continued, ignoring my protest. The shroud is thinning. The shadow of the great collapse is reaching out once more. You must remember the sequence, Eris. You must remember how to harmonize the void. I don't know any sequences, I shouted. I'm just an engineer from Chicago. Suddenly, the garden began to shatter. Great cracks appeared in the indigo sky, and the glass trees splintered into a million pieces. The beautiful woman vanished, her face turning into a mask of terror. They are coming, she cried. The purge is here. Hide the residue. Hide the light. I was slammed back into my body. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike driven through my brain. I was screaming, my back arching off the floor as the cortex peeler shrieked in protest. System failure, one of the technicians yelled. The neural feedback is too strong. It's overloading the dampeners. Keep it running, Malachor commanded. Isolate the source. I can't. It's not a memory. It's a live signal. Through the haze of pain, I saw Vanya break free from her guards. She didn't run for the door. She ran for me. She slammed her hand against the control console of the peeler, her bioluminescent lines flaring so bright they blinded everyone in the room. Enough, she screamed. An electromagnetic pulse rippled through the cell. The cortex peeler sparked and died, the heavy probes falling away from my head. The guards collapsed, their armor's internal systems fried by the burst of energy. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, my vision swimming with silver stars. I could feel something new inside my head, something heavy and ancient, like a library had been dropped into a shoebox. Vanya knelt beside me, her 4 silver eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Kaylin, she whispered, her voice trembling. I shouldn't have screamed. I put you in danger. Yeah, I croaked, trying to find my voice. A little heads up would have been nice. Hey, by the way, you're an ancient alien ghost carrier. Could have saved me a lot of trouble. We have to move, she said, helping me to my feet. My legs felt like they were made of overcooked noodles. Malachor will call for reinforcements. The council will not stop until you are dead. Great, I muttered, leaning on her as we stumbled toward the door. Can we stop by the gift shop? I really want to. I survived the cortex peeler, and all I got was this lousy ancient memory t-shirt. Keep your humor, Kaylin, Vanya said, her gaze hardening as she looked down the corridor. You're going to need it. The void is waking up, and you're the only one who knows how to put it back to sleep. As we ran into the dark corridors of Terminal 9, I realized with a sinking feeling that my life as a mediocre engineer was officially over. I was a harbinger, a residue, and a target. And for some reason, the only thing I could think about was the silver sun in the glass garden and the promise I didn't remember making. The corridors of Terminal 9 were a labyrinth of rusted bulkheads and flickering emergency lights that cast long, predatory shadows across the deck plating. My head was pounding with the rhythm of a malfunctioning fusion core, a direct souvenir from my encounter with the cortex peeler. Every step felt like someone was driving a heated needle into my prefrontal cortex, but Vanya's grip on my arm was the only thing keeping me upright. She was leaning on me just as much as I was leaning on her silver eyes dimmed to a dull pewter, and her lavender skin looking gray in the harsh fluorescent glare. We've got to move faster, Kaylin, she whispered, her voice rasping against the metallic hum of the station. Malachor doesn't play around. He'll have the whole sector locked down tighter than a vacuum seal in 3 minutes. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt like I'd been gargling moon dust. 3 minutes? I can't even find my own shoes in 3 minutes, let alone bug out of a high-security black site. Is there a back door to this place that doesn't involve getting vaporized? Vanya managed a weak, pained smile. We aren't going to the back door. We're going to the underbelly. We ducked behind a stack of shipping crates as a patrol of Purge Council enforcers stomped past. Their heavy boots made a rhythmic clanking sound on the grates, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse with the threat of execution. I watched them through a gap in the crates, my breath hitching in my chest. They were carrying heavy pulse rifles, the kind that didn't just kill you, they turned you into a light show and a smear on the wall. My hands were shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that made me want to tuck them into my pockets and never bring them out again. I wasn't a hero. I was a guy who knew how to balance pressure valves. Vanya, I'm terrified, I admitted, the words spilling out before my cynical filter could catch them. My knees feel like they're made of wet cardboard. Fear is the first layer of the soul, Kaylin, she murmured, her eyes momentarily flashing with a spark of that silver fire I'd seen earlier. It means you're alive. It means the residue is protecting itself. Now move. We scrambled down a maintenance hatch that smelled of grease and old ozone. The ladder rungs were slick with condensation, and I nearly slipped twice, my boots scuffing against the metal with a sound that felt loud enough to wake the entire station. We descended deep into the bowels of Terminal 9, past the pressurized living quarters and the sanitized offices of the bureaucracy, down to where the station's life support systems groaned and wheezed like a dying giant. This was the silent tier, the place where the station's original Athelian architecture was most visible. The walls here weren't just metal, they were a composite material that seemed to breathe, etched with geometric patterns that glowed with a faint, ghostly light. As we moved, I felt a strange resonance in my bones, a vibration that matched the headache in my skull. It was as if the station was recognizing me, whispering secrets in a language I hadn't learned yet. We reached a heavy blast door that looked like it had been welded shut 50 years ago. Vanya slumped against the wall, her breathing ragged. She pointed to a small, unassuming terminal near the door center. "Put your hand on it," she commanded. "What?" "No, that's a high-voltage bypass," I said, my engineering instinct screaming at me. "If I touch that without a grounding kit, I'll be fried before I can say lawsuit." "It's not a bypass," Vanya insisted, her eyes locking onto mine. "It's a palm read for the genetic line. Aristhal built this station. His blood is the only key that still works." I looked at the terminal, then at my shaking hand. I didn't feel like a descendant of a godlike architect. I felt like a terrified engineer who was about to make a very big mistake. But then I looked at Vanya, at the way she had risked everything to pull me out of that cell, at the way her lavender skin was bruising where the guards had grabbed her. She had acted despite being outnumbered and outgunned. "Fine," I muttered. "But if I turn into a human toasted sandwich, I'm haunting your four-eyed ghost forever." I pressed my palm against the cool, dark surface. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a pulse of silver light shot up from the terminal, wrapping around my fingers like a living vine. It didn't burn. It felt warm, like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. The heavy door groaned, the ancient gears grinding together with a shriek of protest, and then it slid open with a hiss of escaping gas. Inside, the room was filled with a swirling, iridescent fog. It didn't sit on the floor like normal smoke. It moved with intent, swirling in complex patterns that defied the station's artificial gravity. In the center of the room stood a suit of pressurized armor, but it wasn't empty. The suit was translucent, and inside, a cloud of glowing blue gas shifted and pulsed, forming the vague shape of a humanoid torso and head. "About time," a voice chirped. The sound was melodic, like a dozen crystal flutes playing at once, but the tone was undeniably annoyed. I was beginning to think I'd have to start a garden in here just to pass the time. And believe me, the soil quality in a vacuum is abysmal. "Sif!" Vanya gasped, nearly falling forward. The gaseous entity moved with impossible speed, the suit's maglev boots clicking against the floor as it caught her. "Careful, Vanya. You look like you've been run through a trash compactor on the high-pressure setting," Sif said, the blue gas inside the suit swirling with concern. "And who is the bipedal disaster area you brought with you?" "This is Kalen," Vanya said, her voice fading. "He is the residue." Sif's suit tilted its head, a glowing blue visor scanning me from head to toe. "A residue? This?" He looks like he'd struggled to calculate the tip on a 3-credit meal. "No offense, Sparky, but I expected someone with a bit more presence." "I'm standing right here," I said, crossing my arms. "And for the record, I'm a great tipper." "Who or what are you?" "I am Sif, a phase-shifted intelligence," the entity replied, its metallic suit bowing with exaggerated theatricality. "I was the navigator for the Athelian High Council, but after the purge, I found myself somewhat unemployed. Now I'm just the guy who keeps the lights on in the Ham Moem Lung. And since you've managed to stumble into my parlor, I assume you're looking for a way out?" "Malachor is right behind us," Vanya said, her eyes closing. "He's found the signal." Scifi's blue gas turned a sharp, angry red. That old buzzard? He's still flapping around? Right. Time to bug out. We've got a locust vessel in the subdock, but she's a bit temperamental. Needs a steady hand and a lot of luck. Can you fly it? I asked, my heart hammering as a distant explosion rocked the floor. I can navigate a needle through a supernova, Sparky, Sif chirped, moving toward the back of the chamber. But I don't have hands. I'm a cloud of sentient neon, remember? You're the engineer. You're going to have to talk to the engines. I looked at the swirling fog, then at the unconscious Vanya, and then at the dark tunnel leading to the docks. Every instinct I had told me to run, to hide in a maintenance crawl space and wait for the storm to pass. But the memory of the silver sun was still burning in the back of my mind, and I knew that if I left Vanya now, I'd be losing more than just my life. I'd be losing the only part of me that mattered. Lead the way, Candlelight, I said, picking Vanya up in my arms. Her weight was surprisingly light, her head lolling against my shoulder. I'm an engineer. I can talk to anything with a combustion chamber. We raced through the subdocks, the sound of pursuer boots getting louder with every second. The locust vessel was a sleek silver needle of a ship, looking like it had been grown rather than built. Its hull was covered in the same shifting patterns as the station, but it was scarred and pitted, the metal looking tired. Get in, Sif shouted, the suit's maglevs sparking as it leaped into the pilot's chair. I threw Vanya into a passenger seat and lunged for the engineering console. It wasn't like any control panel I'd ever seen. There were no buttons, no switches, just a pool of liquid silver that sat in a shallow basin. What do? I yelled as the hangar doors behind us began to buckle under the weight of a thermal charge. Think at it, Sif yelled back. Harmonize. Tell the ship we're leaving, or we're going to be a part of the floor decorations. I closed my eyes and plunged my hands into the liquid silver. It was cold, then hot, then everything at once. I didn't think about engines or fuel or thrust. I thought about the way a bridge feels when it's perfectly balanced. I thought about the silence of the void. I thought about the silver garden. The ship didn't roar. It sighed. A deep, resonant vibration shook the deck, and suddenly the hangar was gone, replaced by the streaking white lights of hyperspace. I fell back into my seat, my lungs burning, my heart trying to punch its way out of my chest. We're out, I gasped, looking at my hands. They were covered in silver residue that was slowly sinking into my skin. We actually made it. Don't celebrate yet, Sparky, Sif said, the blue gas inside the suit glowing with a weary light. We've just jumped from the frying pan into the cold, dark, unforgiving vacuum of the silent sector. And Malachor has a very long memory. I looked over at Vanya. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow, but her hand was twitching, her fingers reaching for something only she could see. I realized then that the fear wasn't gone. It was just changing shape. I was still terrified, but for the first time in my life, I was terrified for someone other than myself. Welcome to the family, Kalen, I whispered to the empty air. It's a complete disaster. The interior of the locust vessel was less like a ship and more like the inside of a giant, bioluminescent seashell. The walls were curved and organic, pulsing with a soft, rhythmic amber light that seemed to match my own heartbeat. There was no hum of a fusion reactor, no clatter of ventilation fans. The silence was absolute, heavy and thick like a velvet blanket. It was the kind of quiet that made you want to whisper, even if there was no one around to hear you. We had been in transit for 5 hours according to the ship's internal chronometer. Sif was at the front, his armored suit plugged into the navigation sphere, his blue gaseous form swirling in a lazy, meditative spiral. Vanya was still out cold in the medical bay, a small alcove where the walls were secreting a translucent gel that was slowly repairing the damage to her nervous system. I was sitting in the engineering nook, staring at my hands. The silver residue from the control basin had vanished into my pores, but I could still feel it, a faint, electric tingle that traced the lines of my veins. I felt like a machine that had been overclocked, my senses sharp and jagged. I could hear the faint whisper of the shroud's energy leaking across the sector, a sound like distant glass breaking in a slow-motion storm. You're thinking too loud, Sparky. It's vibrating the bulkheads. I looked up. Sif had unplugged from the sphere and was hovering a few inches off the floor, his suit's limbs moving with a fluid, uncanny grace. "I'm just trying to make sense of the math," I said, rubbing my temples. "The way this ship moves, it doesn't use standard spatial folding. It's as if it's sliding through the gaps between the atoms of reality." "Bingo," Sif chirped, his blue light turning a bright, approving yellow. "We call it the phase slip." The Ethel realized that the universe isn't a solid block. It's a weave. If you know where the loose threads are, you can move between the stitches. Aristotle was the one who mapped the first 100 paths. Aristotle, I repeated the name, and it felt like a heavy weight in my mouth. Everyone keeps saying that name. Malachor, Vanya, you. If I'm supposed to be his residue, then why don't I remember anything? Why do I still feel like a guy who's 3 months behind on his rent in Chicago? "Because memories aren't just data, Kalen," Sif said, his voice turning soft, the flute-like tones harmonizing into something almost somber. "They're experiences. They're heavy. If the full weight of Aristotle's mind hit your human brain all at once, you'd pop like a balloon in a vacuum. The genetic sequence is a drip feed. It's giving you what you need when you need it." "Like the way I knew how to start the ship?" I asked. "Exactly. Your survival instinct triggered the bridge, but the deeper stuff, the physics, the philosophy, the architecture of the shroud, that takes time and trust." I stood up and paced the small cabin. 3 meters forward, 3 meters back, 6 meters of silver-etched deck plating. Trust is a hard currency in the fringe, Sif. I've spent 10 years fixing heaters and oxygen scrubbers for people who would sell me for a handful of credits the moment I turn my back. Why should I trust a lavender lady I just met and a sentient cloud in a tin can? Sif didn't answer immediately. He drifted over to the viewport, where the streaking lights of hyperspace were beginning to shift from white to a deep, ominous red. "Because Vanya next spent the last 20 years of her life searching for you," he finally said. "She didn't have to scream at that terminal. She could have stayed in the shadows, watched you get processed, and lived a quiet, boring life. But she chose to reveal herself to save you. She chose to take a pulse charge to the chest to get you to this ship." I looked toward the medical bay. The amber light was pulsing over Vanya's face, highlighting the intricate silver patterns on her skin. She had looked so strong at the station, so certain. Now she looked small and fragile. "She's the last vision seer, Kalen," Sif continued. "Her mother was murdered by Malachor's Purge Council because she wouldn't give up the location of the residue. Vanya has been carrying that burden alone since she was 12 years old. She isn't doing this for a dead empire. She's doing it for the people who are still alive, the billions of lives that will be snuffed out if that shroud collapses." The secondary theme, family as choice, hit me then, unexpected and sharp. I had no one back on Earth. No parents, no siblings, just a cat named Photon and a stack of unpaid bills. I'd always thought that made me free. But standing here, in the middle of the whispering void, I realized it just made me empty. Vanya and Sif weren't my blood, but they were the only ones standing between me and the dark. They had chosen me. "Why me?" I whispered. "Out of all the billions of humans, why did Aristotle pick my bloodline?" Sif turned back from the viewport. "Because your ancestors were the ones who stayed," he said. "When the Ethel realized they were losing the war, some wanted to burn everything down. But Aristotle and his followers believed in humanity. They saw a spark of stubborn courage in your species that they had lost in their own. They didn't want to conquer you. They wanted to hide their hope in you." The ship suddenly lurched, a violent shudder that sent me crashing against the wall. The amber lights flickered and turned a screaming crimson. "Sif! What was that?" I yelled, scrambling for a handhold. "The red shift," Sif shouted, his blue gas flashing a frantic violet. "The singularity shroud just had a major containment failure in Sector 7. The gravitational shockwave is hitting us even in hyperspace." I lunged for the engineering nook, my hands finding the liquid silver basin. The moment I touched it, my mind was flooded with a terrifying vision of reality tearing apart. I saw the black hole at the center of the sector, a hungry eye of darkness that was beginning to pull the very fabric of space into its maw. The shroud, the ancient golden net that held the eye closed, was fraying. Thousands of golden threads were snapping, releasing bursts of radiation that were incinerating entire star systems. "I can see it," I gasped, the silver residue crawling up my arms. "Sif, the fourth dampener, is flatlining. The harmonic frequency is off by 55 kilohertz. Can you fix it from here?" Sif yelled, struggling to keep the ship stable as the gravity wells around us began to warp. "No, I need to be at the Ham Moem Lang. We need the primary catalyst. We're 4 light years away. We won't make it before the next wave hits." I grit my teeth, the pain in my head turning into a roar. I didn't think about the distance. I didn't think about the impossibility of the task. I thought about Vanya in the medbay. I thought about the billions of people on the planets below who didn't even know they were about to die. I thought about the bridge. "Hold on," I screamed. I didn't use the ship's engines. I used the memory of the garden. I reached out with my mind, finding the threads of the universe that Oristhal had mapped, and I pulled. The ship didn't just move, it vanished. For a split second, I wasn't Kalen Voss, and I wasn't Oristhal. I was a point of light moving through an infinite ocean of stars. I saw the beginning of time and the end of it, all compressed into a single, blinding heartbeat. Then the world turned solid again. We were floating in the shadow of a massive, jagged moon. Above us, the broken tower of the Ham Moem Lang reached toward the stars like a skeletal finger. The ship was silent, the liquid silver in the basin now a dull, inert gray. I slumped over the console, my breath coming in ragged gas. You just pulled a 2.6 megaparsec jump in 3 seconds? Sif whispered, his suit's lights dimming to a faint, awestruck blue. "Sparky, I think I need to take back what I said about your math skills." I didn't answer. I was too busy watching my hands. They were still shaking, but the fear was different now. It wasn't the fear of a man trying to save his own skin. It was the fear of a man who realized he held the weight of the world in his palms. Vanya appeared at the doorway of the medical bay, leaning heavily against the frame. Her silver eyes were clear again, focusing on me with an expression that made me look away. "You remembered," she said softly. "Not everything," I replied, my voice cracking. "But I remembered enough to get us here." "We're not safe yet," Vanya warned, her gaze shifting to the viewport. "Look." Far off in the distance, a fleet of sleek black ships was emerging from the shadows of the moon. They weren't Athelian. They were the Purge Council, Malakor's hunters, and they weren't here to negotiate. "They're after the catalyst," Sif said, his gaseous form turning a determined, dark emerald. "If they get it, they won't just destroy the shroud. They'll use it to erase every trace of the Ethel from the timeline." I looked at the broken tower, then at the black ships, and then at Vanya. I was terrified. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to turn the ship around and run as far as I could. But I knew I couldn't. Not because of Aristhal's memories, but because of the man I was becoming. "Courage isn't about not being scared, Sif," I said, reaching for my duffel bag and pulling out my plasma wrench. "It's about being scared to death and then doing the job anyway." Sif's visor flared with a bright, defiant gold. "Well said, Sparky. Now let's go show these squids why you don't mess with an engineer on a deadline." We left the ship and began the long, low-gravity trek toward the Ham Moem Lang. Above us, the sky was beginning to turn red as the shroud continued to fail. Every step was a struggle, every breath a choice. I knew that the next few hours would change everything. I might lose my name, my memories, and my life. But as I looked at Vanya and Sif, I realized that for the first time in 34 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was Kalen Voss, and I was going to fix this. The sky above the moon of Theos was no longer the deep, comforting black of the void. It had bruised into a violent, pulsating shade of crimson, a phenomenon Sif called the redshift. It wasn't just a trick of the light, it was the color of space-time bleeding. Every time the singularity shroud buckled, a wave of gravitational distortion rippled through the sector, tearing at the fabric of reality like a blunt knife through silk. We were halfway between the landing pad and the jagged silhouette of the broken tower when the first real shock wave hit. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a sudden, gut-wrenching shift in weight that made my inner ear scream in protest. The ground beneath my boots rippled like liquid. 1 second, I was 10 centimeters off the deck in low gravity, and the next I felt like 3,000 kilos of lead were crushing me into the lunar dust. "Kalen! Stay low!" Vanya shouted through the comms. Her voice was strained, competing with the static of the collapsing magnetic field. I hit the dirt, my faceplate clouding with dust. Through the red haze of the sky, I saw the Singularity Shroud flickering miles above. It looked like a burning net of gold, thousands of threads snapping in slow motion. Each break released a burst of hawking radiation that lit up the horizon like a dying star. "My sensors are redlining, Sparky," Sif's voice chirped in my ear, unusually sharp. "That last wave just cooked the long-range scanners. We've got dead air for 500 kilometers. If Malakor's goons are out there, we won't see them until they're close enough to spit on us." I scrambled to my feet, my lungs burning. The air in my suit tasted like recycled rubber and desperation. I looked back at the Locust vessel, our only way off this rock. It sat huddled on the pad, its silver hull glowing with a faint defensive light. I could leave. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had the codes. I knew how to jump the ship now. I could dump Vanya in the sentient neon cloud, punch a hole into hyperspace, and be halfway to the Orion Nebula before the Purge Council even realized I was gone. I could go back to being a mediocre engineer, a ghost in a galaxy that didn't care about ethyl residues or ancient gardens. "Kalen?" Vanya was looking at me, her 4 silver eyes wide behind her visor. She didn't say anything, but I could see the fatigue etched into the lines of her face. She was waiting for me to break. She expected it. Why wouldn't she? I was a human, a mediocre record in a galaxy of gods. "Don't look at me like that," I snapped, the sarcasm a thin shield against the sheer terror crawling up my spine. "I'm just calculating the structural integrity of this dust ball. It's a hobby." "Eyes up, Sparky," Sif yelled. "We've got company." From behind the jagged ridge of a nearby crater, 3 sleek, black shapes rose into the air. They were Purge Council interceptors, hollow ships, the street slang for vessels that were piloted by brain-scrubbed zealots. They didn't have cockpits, only sensors that fed directly into the pilot's optic nerves. They were fast, mean, and programmed for one thing: total erasure. Take cover. Vanya tackled me just as a beam of concentrated ultraviolet energy lanced through the air where my head had been a second before. The rock behind us shattered, turning into molten slag instantly. I pulled my plasma wrench from my belt. It was a tool, not a weapon, but at the right frequency, it could short-circuit a shield generator if I got close enough, which, considering I was currently eating moon dust, seemed about as likely as me winning the Galactic lottery. "Sif, can you distract those tin heads?" I shouted, the static in my helmet getting worse. "I'm on it." Sif's armored suit suddenly vented a massive cloud of glowing blue gas. The gas didn't dissipate. It expanded, forming a shimmering, multi-layered decoys that mirrored the suit's energy signature. The interceptors wavered, their targeting systems confused by the sudden bloom of 4 different Sifs dancing across the crater. "Go! Move to the tower!" Sif commanded, his flute-like voice rising to a frantic crescendo. "I can't hold the masquerade for more than 2 minutes." We ran. My boots kicked up clouds of gray regalia, each step a frantic leap in the low gravity. Behind us, the interceptors were opening fire, their beams cutting through Sif's decoys with a sound like tearing metal. We reached the base of the broken tower, the Vault of Silence. Up close, it was terrifying. The Athelian architecture didn't look built. It looked grown, like a mountain made of obsidian and bone. The surface was covered in billions of microscopic fissures that whispered as the solar wind passed over them. It was a monument to a civilization that had played with the fundamental forces of the universe and lost. The entrance was a vertical slit in the stone, pulsing with a faint silver light. Vanya slammed her hand against the interface, but the door didn't budge. "It's locked!" she cried, her voice rising in panic. "The internal security has defaulted to the Eris protocol. Kalen, it won't open for me." I stepped forward, my hands shaking so hard I could barely see the console. I looked up at the red sky. A massive segment of the singularity shroud was falling, a golden curtain of fire that would incinerate the moon in less than 10 minutes. In that moment, the cynicism felt hollow. If I ran, I died. If I stayed and failed, I died. But if I stayed and fought, there was a chance that Vanya might live. I closed my eyes and reached out. I didn't look for a button or a palm scanner. I looked for the vibration. I reached into that heavy, ancient library in the back of my brain and pulled out a single thread of harmonic resonance. I hummed a low, guttural note, a frequency that felt like it was being pulled from my very marrow. The tower groaned. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the ground, vibrating in my teeth. The obsidian walls shivered, and the vertical slit widened, inviting us into the cool, dark interior. "Inside!" I yelled, grabbing Vanya's hand and pulling her through the gap, just as another ultraviolet beam scorched the ground behind us. The doors hissed shut, plunging us into a silence so absolute it felt like being submerged in water. The air was thick and tasted of ancient libraries and cold metal. "We made it," Vanya whispered, her silver eyes reflecting the dim glow of the interior walls. "For now," I said, leaning against the wall and trying to get my heart rate under 200 beats per minute. "But Malachor isn't going to go away because we shut the front door. He's going to bring the house down." Sif drifted through the door a second later, his gaseous form looking thin and ragged inside the suit. "That was uncomfortably close," he chirped, his blue light flickering. "I lost 3 layers of containment gas back there. I'm feeling a bit lightheaded, literally." "Can you seal the perimeter?" I asked, my engineering mind already trying to map the tower's internal systems. "I'm already in the walls," Sif said, his suit's visor glowing as he interfaced with the tower's ancient core. "I've triggered the internal dampeners and rerouted power to the shield fences. It'll hold off the ground pounders. But the shroud... Kalen, the shroud is going to snap in 6 minutes. If we don't activate the catalyst, there won't be a moon left to defend." "Lead the way," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Let's go talk to this ghost." We began our descent into the heart of the vault, moving down a spiral ramp that seemed to go on for miles. As we went deeper, the Athelian markings on the walls changed. They became more complex, more frantic. I saw depictions of great wars, of stars being snuffed out, and of a desperate flight across the stars. But there was something else. Interspersed with the alien script were symbols I recognized. Not from my engineering textbooks, but from Earth. A double helix, a mathematical constant, a rough sketch of the Orion constellation as seen from the northern hemisphere. "Vanya," I said, stopping in front of a particularly large mural. "Look at this." She paused, her 4 eyes scanning the wall. "It's the history of the first diaspora," she said softly, the Ethel leaving their dying home to find a new world. I shook my head, my hand tracing the familiar curve of a DNA strand etched into the stone. "No, that's not alien biology. That's us. That's human." Vanya looked at me, confusion clouding her silver eyes. "Kalen, the Ethel were ancient when your species was still throwing rocks at mammoths." "Are they?" I asked, the first layer of the truth beginning to peel away in my mind. Or are we just looking at the map from the wrong end? The deeper we went, the louder the whispers became. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were echoing through the corridors, 1,000 voices speaking in 1,000 tongues, all of them blending into a single haunting harmony. We reached the bottom of the ramp, arriving at a massive, circular chamber dominated by a pool of liquid silver that mirrored the red sky far above. In the center of the pool stood a single tall pillar of obsidian, and on that pillar sat a device that looked like a human heart made of clockwork and light. "The primary catalyst," Vanya whispered, falling to her knees in reverence. I didn't kneel. I walked toward the pool, my boots echoing on the stone. The cynicism was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I realized that the fear I'd felt wasn't just my own. It was the fear of every person who had ever built something and watched it break. It was the fear of the architects who had stood in this very room 60 cycles ago and realized they couldn't save their world. "Kalen, wait!" Sif called out. "The resonance is too high. You need to calibrate." I didn't stop. I couldn't. The drip feed of Aristotle's memories was turning into a flood. I stepped into the liquid silver pool, the cold metallic fluid rising to my knees. As I reached for the catalyst, the shadows in the room began to shift and coalesce. A figure emerged from the obsidian pillar. It wasn't a hologram, it was a reflection. It was a man tall and weary, wearing robes that looked like they were woven from starlight. He had my eyes, he had my nose. He even had the same annoying habit of tilting his head to the left when he was thinking. Aristotle, I whispered. The reflection smiled, a sad, knowing expression. Not Eris, he said, his voice echoing in my mind with the clarity of a bell. Just a message in a bottle, Kalen Voss, from one engineer to another. The tower shook as a massive explosion hit the upper tiers. Malachor had arrived, but I didn't look up. I was staring into the mirror of the past, and for the first time, the math finally made sense. The chamber was vibrating with the force of the siege above, but inside the circle of the silver pool, the air was as still as a tomb. The reflection of the man who looked like me, the man the galaxy called Aristotle, stayed perfectly motionless, his robes of starlight rippling in a wind that didn't exist. Vanya was silent, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared at the figure. Sif had retreated to the edge of the pool, his gaseous form pulsing in a frantic, awestruck gold. I stayed in the liquid silver, the cold metal seeping into my suit, into my skin. I felt a strange sense of belonging, as if I had finally stopped fighting the current and let myself be carried by the river. You're not an alien, I said, my voice echoing in the vast chamber. The slang, the sarcasm, the armor, it all felt like a suit of clothes that no longer fit. The Ethel, you're not from another star system. You're from Earth. The figure nodded slowly. Not the Earth you know, Kalen. Not yet. We are the survivors of the 10,000-year war. The ones who saw the sun begin to expand, who watched the oceans boil, and realized that our home was no longer a cradle, but a furnace. I felt the weight of his words settle in my chest like a leaden anchor. A future timeline, I whispered. The Ethel are humans who escaped the death of Earth, went back in time, and tried to rebuild. We were arrogant, the reflection of Aristotle said, his voice filled with a centuries-old grief. We thought that with our knowledge of the future, we could skip the mistakes of the past. We built the singularity shroud not just to power our cities, but to anchor ourselves to this era. We tried to stop the clock. But the universe doesn't like being told to sit still. He stepped forward, his feet making no ripples in the silver pool. The great collapse wasn't an accident. It was the timeline trying to snap back into place. Our very presence here created the rift. We weren't gods, Kalen. We were refugees who overstayed our welcome. Vanya stepped into the pool, her lavender skin glowing with a sudden, fierce light. Then why the residue? Why hide your memories in the DNA of the mediocre humans of the past? Aristotle turned his gaze toward her, and his eyes softened. Because we realized we couldn't stay. We had to fade away to let the timeline heal. But we knew the rift we created, the black hole at the center of this sector, wouldn't just vanish. It would wait, it would grow, and one day humanity would reach the stars again, and they would find the shroud failing. He looked back at me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my teeth ache. We didn't hide our memories to be reborn, Kalen. We hid them so that when the time came, there would be an engineer who understood the problem. A bridge between what was and what will be. A massive boom rocked the tower, and this time the ceiling cracked. A shower of obsidian dust fell into the silver pool, shattering the reflection for a heartbeat. Malachor is through the second gate, Sif shouted, his blue light flashing a desperate red. He's got a thermal borer, Sparky. He's going to turn this chamber into a volcano in less than 3 minutes. I looked at the catalyst on its pillar. It was pulsing with a soft amber light, a mechanical heart waiting for a beat. I understood now. I wasn't being overwritten by an alien ghost. I was being given the blueprints by my own ancestors. The fear was still there, a cold, sharp blade in my gut. But it was no longer a reason to run. It was a reason to hurry. How do I fix it? I asked the reflection. The shroud is snapping. Millions of people are on the colonies in the habitable zone. If the rift expands, they're gone. The catalyst is a chrono anchor, Aristhal explained as his form began to flicker, the power in the room failing. It doesn't fix the shroud with plasma or harmonics. It fixes it with choice. You must interface with the core, Kalen. You must take the weight of the timeline into your own mind and choose to anchor it. But be warned, once you connect, there is no going back to being just Kalen Voss. You will see the truth of all things, and that knowledge is a heavy burden for a single soul. Kalen, don't, Vanya said, reaching for my arm. Her eyes were filled with a sudden, sharp terror. Malakor's men, they'll kill you the moment you connect, or the power will fry your brain. There has to be another way. We can bug out, find a way to warn the colonies. There is no other way, Vanya, I said, and for the first time, I didn't sound like a cynical engineer. I sounded like the man I was supposed to be. I looked at her, at the silver markings on her skin that I now knew were the result of future human genetic drift. She wasn't an alien. She was my kin, separated by 10,000 years and 1,000 mistakes. I've spent my whole life running from things that were too heavy, I said, my voice steady. I ran from Earth because it was too small. I ran from people because they were too messy. But I'm tired of running. If I'm the bridge, then it's time I started acting like a structural engineer. I turned to the catalyst. I could hear the hollow men in the corridor outside, the hiss of their energy weapons cutting through the final door. Sif, give me everything, I commanded. Every scrap of power left in the ship, every watt in the tower's battery. I need a clean connection. You got it, Sparky, Sif chirped, though his voice was thick with what sounded like digital tears. Initiating full power shunt. I'm ghosting the external shields. It's all yours. The room went dark as every light in the tower was extinguished. The power redirected into the silver pool. The liquid metal began to glow with a blinding, white-hot intensity. I reached for the catalyst. Remember, Kalen, the flickering voice of Aristhal whispered, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the realization that something else is more important. I grabbed the device. The pain was unlike anything I had ever imagined. It wasn't just physical. It was as if my mind was being pulled through a needle's eye. I saw the birth of the galaxy. I saw the death of the sun. I saw a million different versions of my own life. One where I never left Chicago, one where I died in the immigration line, one where I became the tyrant Malachor feared. And then I saw the shroud. It wasn't a golden net. It was a song, a complex mathematical symphony that was falling out of tune. I could feel the discordant notes, the jagged rhythms of the failing dampeners. I reached out with my mind, my fingers tracing the lines of gravitational force as if they were the strings of a harp. I began to sing, not with my voice, but with my soul. I projected the harmony I had learned in the glass garden, the frequency of balance and peace. The shroud stopped falling. The red sky outside the tower began to fade, the bleeding space-time slowly beginning to clot and heal. But the cost was immediate. I felt my own memories, the smell of rain on a Chicago street, the taste of a cheap protein bar, the annoying way Photon the cat would purr in my ear, starting to slip away, pushed aside by the sheer volume of universal data pouring into my cortex. I was disappearing. I was becoming the bridge, and the bridge didn't have room for a person named Kalen. Kalen, stay with me! Vanya's voice reached me, faint and distorted. She was screaming my name, her silver eyes the only thing keeping me anchored to the present. The doors to the chamber exploded. Malachor strode into the room, his charcoal robes billowing around him, a heavy pulse pistol leveled at my head. Abomination! He shrieked, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. You would bring the plague back to the stars. Die with your ghosts! He fired. The purple beam lanced through the air, heading straight for my chest. I couldn't move. I was locked into the catalyst, my mind halfway across the sector. But I didn't die. Vanya leaped in front of me. The beam hit her squarely in the shoulder, throwing her backward into the silver pool. She screamed, a sound of pure agony that tore through the harmonic song I was building. Vanya! I roared. The connection to the shroud wavered. The sky outside began to turn red again. The fear came back, stronger than ever. A cold, paralyzing terror that I was going to lose the only person who had ever truly chosen me. Finish it! Vanya gasped from the silver pool, her lavender skin scorched and bleeding. Her eyes were fixed on mine, fierce and unyielding. "Don't let it be for nothing, Kalen. Finish the song." Malachor leveled his pistol again, his eyes wide with religious frenzy. "One more shot, and the galaxy is purified." I looked at him. I looked at Vanya. I looked at the catalyst. In that moment, I realized that I didn't have to be Aristhal to save the world. I didn't have to be a god or a ghost. I just had to be an engineer who loved someone enough to fix a broken heart. I pulled a trick I'd learned in a dirty workshop in Sector 5. I didn't try to harmonize the whole shroud. I focused all the power of the catalyst into a single massive burst of localized gravity. A grav slug we used to use to clear clogged plasma pipes. I didn't fire it at Malachor. I fired it at the obsidian pillar itself. The pillar exploded in a shock wave of silver light. The force of it threw Malachor and his men back across the room, their armor's internal stabilizers screaming as they were crushed against the walls. The catalyst was free, floating in the air before me, glowing with an impossible brightness. I grabbed Vanya's hand with one hand and the catalyst with the other. "Sif, bug out, now!" I screamed. "With pleasure, Sparky." Sif's voice roared through the comms. The world turned into a blur of silver and gold. We weren't just jumping through space. We were jumping through the cracks in the timeline. I saw Malachor's face as he was swallowed by the shadows of the falling tower. I saw the shroud seal itself with a final, triumphant chime. And then there was only the void. We were back on the Locust vessel, drifting in the quiet dark of the silent sector. The amber lights were pulsing softly again, the ship sighing as it settled into a stable orbit. I was on the floor holding Vanya. She was breathing, though her eyes were closed. The catalyst sat on the deck between us, now a piece of inert, cold crystal. "Is it over?" I whispered, my voice sounding like gravel. "The shroud is stable, Kalen," Sif said, his gaseous form glowing with a soft, comforting green. "The colonies are safe. The rift has been sealed for at least another 1,000 years." I looked at my hands. They were still mine. The memories were still there. The rain, the protein bar, the cat. I hadn't disappeared. "How?" I asked. "Aristhal said I would lose myself." "You didn't follow the protocol, Sparky," Sif chirped, a hint of his old humor returning. "You used a plumbing trick to short-circuit a god machine. You broke the bridge to save the people on it. I think you might be the first residue to ever keep his own name." I looked down at Vanya. She opened her eyes, her 4 silver orbs focusing on me with a tired, beautiful smile. "Hello, Kalen," she whispered. "Hey," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I leaned my forehead against hers, the silver markings on our skin glowing in the quiet dark. "I think I'm going to need a really long vacation after this. Maybe somewhere with a lot of grass and no ancient towers." "I think I know a place," she said. Outside the viewport, the stars were no longer red. They were bright and steady, burning with a light that had been saved by a mediocre engineer who decided to stop running. The lesson was beginning to bloom in my heart, a stubborn, beautiful truth. Courage wasn't about being a hero. It was about choosing to stay, even when the whole universe was telling you to bug out. And family. Family was the people you were willing to break a god machine for. We weren't the ethel. We weren't the residue. We were just humans, lost in the dark, trying to find our way home. And for the first time in my 34 years, I realized that as long as we had each other, we were already there. The Locust vessel drifted through the velvet dark of the silent sector, its bioluminescent hull pulsing with a rhythm that felt uncomfortably like a dying breath. Inside, the amber light had settled into a dim, sickly ochre. I sat on the deck of the engineering nook, my back against the vibrating silver bulkhead, watching the liquid metal in the basin. It was stagnant now, a mirror of cold mercury that refused to show me my own reflection. Instead, it showed me glimpses of cities I'd never walked through and faces of people who had been dead for 10,000 years. My head felt like it had been stuffed with wet gravel. The plumbing trick I'd used to short-circuit the catalyst had saved our skins, but it had left my neural pathways scorched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Singularity Shroud, not as a piece of hardware, but as a vast, shimmering loom of fate. I could feel the tension of every thread, the minute vibrations of the black hole's hunger, and the groaning weight of the timeline. It was too much for one brain. It was definitely too much for a guy whose greatest professional achievement before this was successfully bypassing the residential power grid in Chicago North without causing a brownout. "You're doing it again, Sparky." I opened my eyes. Sif was hovering a few inches away, his blue gaseous form looking patchy inside the armored suit. He looked like he'd been through a particle accelerator on the wrong setting. One of the suit's arms was dead, hanging limp at his side, and the visor was cracked. "Doing what?" I rasped. My voice sounded like it had been dragged over a mile of jagged asteroids. "Thinking in blueprints," Sif chirped, though the flute-like melody of his voice was punctuated by bursts of static. "Your biosigns are spiking. Your heart rate is doing 75% of a light-speed dash, and your brain waves look like a seismic graph during a planetary fracture. You need to dial it back before you fry your meat circuitry." "I can't just turn it off, Sif," I said, rubbing my face. My skin felt hot, buzzing with a static charge that wouldn't dissipate. "The residue, it's not a drip feed anymore. The dam broke back there at the tower. I can hear the shroud. It's whispering to me. It's telling me that the patch I put on Sector 7 is holding, but Sector 12 is starting to fray. It's like being plugged into a universal diagnostic monitor 24 hours a day." "Welcome to the high-stakes world of Athelian architecture," Sif said, his blue light turning a sympathetic indigo. "It's a heavy lift, I know, but you've got to stay grounded in the here and now, or you'll drift off into the was and will be. And right now, the here and now needs you in the medbay." I looked toward the alcove. Vanya was still suspended in the healing gel, but the amber light was flickering. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. Someone taller, stronger, and much more exhausted. I stumbled toward her, catching myself on the organic curves of the walls. She was awake. Her 4 silver eyes were open, watching me with a lucidity that caught me off guard. The scorch mark on her shoulder was a jagged, angry purple, but the gel was working, knitting the lavender skin back together. "Kaylin," she whispered. The word carried a weight of relief that made my throat tighten. "Don't try to move," I said, kneeling beside the alcove. "You took a heavy hitter from me, Vanya. That shot was meant to turn my chest into a sunroof." "I chose to," she said, her voice stronger than I expected. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against my forearm. I saw the moment, Kaylin, in the vision. I knew the choice was coming. I wasn't acting out of duty. I was acting out of us. I looked down at her hand. The silver patterns on her skin were pulsing faintly, synchronizing with the electric tingle in my own veins. "We're a mess, aren't we? A human engineer with a ghost in his head and a vision seer who treats pulse rounds like a light snack." "We're alive," she corrected softly. "That's more than most people get when they cross Malachor." "Malachor," I spat the name. "He's still out there, Vanya." I felt the grav slug hit him, but I also felt his hatred. It's like a cold spot in the shroud. "He's not dead. Fanatics like that don't die easy. They just get meaner." "He believes he is saving the galaxy," Vanya said, her silver eyes clouding with sorrow. "He thinks the Ethel are a virus. He doesn't understand that we are just the harvest of a future that hasn't happened yet. He is terrified of the dark, so he tries to burn everything that glows." "Yeah, well, he's doing a great job of making the galaxy a darker place," I said, leaning my head against the cool alcove frame. I felt the transformation beginning, that slow, painful expansion of my perspective. I was starting to see the Purge Council not just as enemies, but as a symptom of a systemic failure. They were the result of a civilization that had been told to fear its own potential. For 34 years, I'd lived my life according to a simple set of rules. Stay under the radar, fix the pipes, and never get emotionally invested in something that can't be repaired with a wrench. It was a safe way to live. A lonely way, too, though I'd never admitted it. But now those rules were as useless as a wooden shield in a plasma fight. "Kaylin," Vanya said, her grip on my arm tightening, "you have to tell me, when you connected to the catalyst, what did you see? Not the math. Not the blueprints. What did you feel?" I hesitated. How could I explain the sensation of being a billion people at once? How could I describe the crushing weight of every mistake my ancestors had made, and the dizzying hope of every choice they had yet to make? I felt the fear, I finally said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I felt how scared Aristhal was. He wasn't a god, Vanya. He was a man who was terrified that he was building a prison instead of a sanctuary. And I felt his love for your mother. It wasn't just a psychic link. It was the reason he stayed. He could have jumped the whole civilization forward, skipped the war, skipped the collapse, but he stayed because he wouldn't leave her behind in a timeline that was breaking. Vanya's eyes filled with glowing tears. Choice. It always comes back to choice. Yeah, I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. I spent my whole life thinking I was making choices, but I was just reacting. I was a ball in a pinball machine, bouncing off the obstacles. But back at the tower, when I fired that slug at the pillar instead of Malachor, that was me. That was Kalen Voss, the guy who hates following the manual. And that is why you survived, Sif chirped from the doorway. He had moved closer, his blue light now a soft, pulsing violet. The Ethel Protocol expected a vessel that would surrender. It expected a puppet for the ghost. But you, Sparky, you're too stubborn to be a puppet. You kept your hand on the wrench. Suddenly the ship groaned. It wasn't the sound of structural failure, but a high-pitched harmonic whine that made my teeth vibrate. The amber lights flashed to a frantic, strobing white. Sif, report, I yelled, springing to my feet despite the dizziness that threatened to topple me. We've got a localized resonance spike, Sif shouted, his suit's maglevs sparking as he lunged for the pilot's sphere. Something is pulling us out of stealth. It's a tracker, but it's not using standard radio waves. It's a genetic pinger. Malachor, Vanya gasped, struggling to sit up in the medical alcove. He's using the blood I left in the silver pool. He's tuned his scanners to my resonance. I lunged for the engineering basin, plunging my hands into the liquid silver. The tingle turned into a burn instantly. I saw the void outside the ship, and I saw the black dots of Purge Council vessels emerging from the shadow of a nearby gas giant. There were 10 of them, 20, a whole fleet of hollow ships, their ultraviolet beams already charging. They're pinning us, Sif yelled. We can't jump. The gravitational field is too messy. I felt the fear rise up, the old familiar urge to bug out, to find a hole and crawl into it. But then I looked at Vanya. She was pale, her wound still fresh, but she was looking at me with absolute, unwavering trust. She had chosen me. Sif had chosen me. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I wasn't just fixing a ship. I was protecting my family. Sif, reroute the life support power to the hull shifters, I commanded. My voice didn't shake. It was the voice of a man who had stopped running. Life support, Sif squawked. We'll be breathing vacuum in 5 minutes, Sparky. We only need 3, I shouted, the silver residue crawling up my neck, my eyes glowing with an ancient golden fire. Vanya, I need your eyes. Link with the ship's optic sensors. Show me the gaps between their shields. Vanya didn't hesitate. She closed her eyes, her silver markings flaring to a blinding brilliance. I see them, Kalen. The lead ship. Malachor is there. His shield has a harmonic leak in the 300 terahertz range. Got it, I growled. I didn't use the ship's weapons. I used the shroud. I reached out across the light years, finding the threads of the singularity shroud that I had repaired. I didn't pull on them. I plucked them. The shockwave that hit the Purge Council fleet wasn't an explosion of fire, but an explosion of geometry. Space-time rippled like a disturbed pond. The hollow ships were tossed around like toys in a hurricane, their ultraviolet beams bending back on themselves as the very gravity of the sector turned into a weapon. What are you doing? Malachor's voice cracked across the emergency frequency, filled with a mixture of terror and fury. You are tearing the universe apart. No, Malachor, I shouted back, my voice echoing through the ship's speakers. I'm just retuning the neighborhood, and you're out of tune. The lead ship's shields shattered under the pressure of the gravitational ripple. The black vessel spun wildly, its hull buckling as the shroud's energy reclaimed the space it occupied. Now, Sif! Jump, I yelled. The locust vessel vanished into a silver streak just as the first ultraviolet beam from the secondary ships hit our previous coordinates. We weren't just moving through space. We were moving through the choice I had made. The cost was high. My vision went white, and the smell of ozone filled my nose as the neural feedback nearly fried my consciousness. But as we settled into the quiet dark of a new sector, I realized the truth. Courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about what you were willing to sacrifice your fear for. And as I slumped back into my seat, my hands still silver, my heart still human, I knew that the real work was only just beginning. We had emerged in the shadow of the event horizon, not the literal edge of a black hole, but a region of space where the Athelian influence was so thick that the stars looked like smeared oil on a canvas of deep indigo. This was the Whispering Reach, a graveyard of ancient stations and derelict hulls that Malakor's council had never dared to enter. The gravity here was a chaotic mess, a tangled knot of old physics that only a ship like ours could navigate. The Locust vessel was hobbled. The jump had drained the last of our primary power cells, and the hull shifters were jammed in a semi-phase state, making the ship look like a flickering ghost. I stood in the center of the bridge, my legs trembling, my mind a jagged landscape of overlapping realities. Vanya was out of the medical alcove, her arm in a makeshift sling, her 4 eyes scanning the flickering displays. Sif was silent, his suit slumped in the pilot's seat, his blue gas a dim, exhausted flicker. "We can't keep doing this, Kalen," Vanya said, her voice heavy with the realization of our situation. "Every time you pluck the shroud, you're losing a piece of yourself. I can see it. Your resonance is shifting. You're becoming less of the man who likes Chicago rain and more of the man who built the stars." I looked at her, and for a heartbeat, I didn't see just Vanya. I saw the millions of years of evolution that had led to her, the delicate balance of her Athelian human hybridity, and the tragic beauty of her short, intense life. It was a terrifying perspective. It made everything feel small. It made me feel small. "I know," I said, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. "But the shroud is failing, Vanya. The patch I put on Sector 7 was a Band-Aid on a gushing wound. The rift is growing. The black hole at the center, it's not just hungry, it's angry. It knows it shouldn't be here. Then we have to let it go," she said, her silver eyes locking onto mine. "Let it go!" I barked a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "If we let the shroud fail, the rift expands. It consumes the silent sector. It consumes Jathera. It consumes billions of people who don't even know we exist. That's not a choice, Vanya. That's a massacre." "No," she said, stepping closer, her hand finding mine. Her touch was the only thing that felt real in a world that was becoming a mathematical equation. The Ethel tried to anchor the timeline because they were afraid to die. They built a prison of gold to keep the future from happening. But you're a structural engineer, Kalen. You know that you can't fix a foundation that's built on a lie?" I looked at her, the truth of her words hitting me like a physical weight. The shroud wasn't a protector. It was a dam, and the water was rising. "The geometry of sacrifice," I whispered, the phrase bubbling up from Aristotel's memories. "In order for a new structure to rise, the old one must be demolished. We can't just keep patching the shroud. We have to dismantle it. We have to bridge the rift properly, not just plug the hole. And that requires the catalyst," Sif chirped, his blue light flickering back to a determined yellow. "The primary catalyst we took from the tower. It's not just a battery, Sparky. It's a focal point. If we can get it to the center of the shroud, to the very edge of the singularity, we can use it to harmonize the rift with the current timeline. We can turn the black hole into a stable star. But the person who carries the catalyst to the center," I trailed off, the implication clear. "They won't come back," Vanya finished, her voice steady. "The energy required to bridge the dimensions would dissolve the vessel, physical and spiritual." The silence that followed was absolute. For 34 years, I'd been an expert at avoiding the heavy lifting. I'd let other people take the risks while I stayed in the crawl spaces and the workshops. I was the guy who survived by being replaceable. But now, as I looked at the cold, inert crystal of the catalyst sitting on the deck, I realized that I was the only one who could do the job. Only I had the memories of Aristotle and the stubborn, irrational heart of Kalen Voss. "Kalen, look," Sif said, pointing to the external sensors. Coming out of the indigo haze of the Whispering Reach was a single ship. It wasn't a fleet this time. It was a massive, scarred dreadnought, the Purge's Will, Malakor's flagship. It was moving slowly, its heavy ultraviolet cannons tracking our flickering ghost of a ship. He followed us, I said, a strange sense of calm settling over me. He's not here for the galaxy anymore. He's here for me. Then we give him what he wants, Vanya said, her eyes flashing with a sudden fierce light. A target? No, I said, turning to her. I took her face in my hands, my thumbs tracing the silver patterns on her cheeks. You and Sif take the Locust vessel. You've still got enough power for one short-range jump. Get to the neutral colonies. Tell them the truth. Tell them that the Ethel weren't gods, and that the future is something we have to build, not something we have to fear. Kaylin, no! Vanya cried, her hands gripping my wrists. I won't leave you. We chose this together. And I'm choosing this now, I said, my voice cracking. Family isn't just about staying together, Vanya. It's about making sure the people you love have a future to walk into. Sif, get her to the escape pod. Now. Sparky, Sif's gaseous form pulsed a deep, mournful blue. That's an order, Canned Light, I shouted, the silver fire in my eyes flaring. Take care of her. And Sif, find a way to get yourself a body with actual hands. You'd be a lot less annoying if you could actually do the dishes. Sif's visor flared with a bright, defiant gold. I'll consider it. But only if you promise to fix that leaky valve in the med bay before you leave. I smiled, a real human smile that reached my eyes for the first time in weeks. Consider it done. I didn't give Vanya a chance to argue. I used a low-level harmonic pulse, a trick from the library, to gently knock her unconscious. I carried her to the escape pod, laying her down on the soft, organic cushions. I kissed her forehead, the lavender skin feeling warm against my lips. Remember the garden, Vanya, I whispered, and remember the rain. I sealed the pod and watched it launch, a small streak of silver light that vanished into the indigo haze. I was alone. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I was just Kaylin Voss again. I turned back to the bridge. The Purge's Will was closing in, its ultraviolet cannons beginning to glow with a lethal, purple light. I picked up the catalyst. It felt cold and heavy in my hands, a burden of 10,000 years. Okay, Malachor, I said, walking to the airlock. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a shield. I just had a piece of crystal and a bad attitude. You want to purify the galaxy? Let's see how you handle the truth. I opened the airlock. I didn't drift away. I used the gravity of the shroud to pull myself toward the dreadnought. As I floated in the vacuum, the stars around me began to sing. It wasn't a song of destruction, but a song of building. I could see the geometry of the universe, the complex, beautiful math that connected every atom and every soul. Malachor's voice boomed across the internal comms of my suit. You are nothing but a ghost, Voss, a shadow of a dead world. I will erase you from the stars. You can't erase a choice, Malachor, I said, my voice calm as I reached the hull of the dreadnought. I found a maintenance hatch, the same design Aristhal had used for the shroud's nodes. I placed my hand on it and the metal melted away. I entered the ship, moving through the dark corridors toward the primary power core. The hollow men tried to stop me, their ultraviolet beams lancing through the dark. But I didn't fight back. I didn't have to. I was moving between the stitches of reality, a ghost in the machine. I reached the core. It was a massive, throbbing heart of energy, the same design I'd fixed 100 times on 100 different stations. But this one was fueled by the Shroud's energy, stolen by the Purge Council to power their crusade. Malachor was there, standing on the observation deck above the core. He looked like a man who had already died, his skin translucent, his eyes filled with a hollow, religious ecstasy. You are too late, he screamed. The core is reaching critical mass. I will turn this dreadnought into a star that will burn the Athelian heresy from existence. No, Malachor, I said, stepping onto the core's platform. I held the catalyst high. You're just another engineer who doesn't know how to read the manual. I didn't fire a grav slug. I didn't use a plumbing trick. I placed the catalyst directly into the center of the dreadnought's core. The explosion wasn't fire. It was light. A blinding, white-hot brilliance that expanded from the core, swallowing the ship, the fleet, and the entire sector. But it didn't destroy. It transformed. I felt myself dissolving. The memories of Chicago, the smell of rain, the feel of Vanya's hand, they were all becoming part of the light. I was no longer a person. I was a frequency. I was the bridge. And in that final, infinite heartbeat, I saw the shroud fall. I saw the black hole at the center of the sector begin to glow with a soft, warm light. I saw the dimensions align, the timeline healing itself as the past and the future finally made peace. The courage hadn't been in the fighting. It had been in the letting go. I saw Vanya's escape pod reaching the safe zones of the neutral colonies. I saw Sif finding a way to transfer his consciousness into a new robotic body. I saw the children of 1,000 different worlds looking up at a sky that was no longer bruised and red, but filled with the steady, beautiful light of a new star. I was gone, but what I had remembered, what I had chosen, lived on in the light. And somewhere, in a garden made of glass, a man who looked like me sat under a silver sun and watched the rain fall on a world that was no longer breaking. The job was done. The structure was sound. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy was finally home. The white was not a color. It was an absolute state of being. After the core of the Purge's will turned into a localized supernova of pure information, I didn't feel the heat of 1,000 suns or the crushing weight of a collapsing hull. I felt unpacked. It was as if every atom of Kalen Voss had been unscrewed from the physical plane and laid out on a cosmic workbench for inspection. There was no sound in the white, but there was a hum, a steady, vibrating frequency that I recognized as the baseline of the universe. It was the sound of the bridge holding. I drifted in that infinite space, my memories floating around me like loose blueprints. I saw the face of my father in Chicago, his hands calloused from work, telling me that a good weld was better than 1,000 promises. I saw Photon the cat, a ginger blur of feline indifference, batting at a stray piece of wire in my old workshop. And I saw Aristhal. He was standing there in the center of the white, looking less like a legend and more like a man who had finally finished a double shift. His robes were gone, replaced by a simple gray tunic that looked remarkably like mine. He didn't look like a god or a ghost anymore. He just looked like a tired engineer. "You really leaned into it, didn't you, Kalen?" he said, his voice echoing through the static of my soul. There was no judgment in his tone, only a weary kind of respect. "The manual said, 'Harmonize the void, Eris,'" I replied. And even here, my voice carried the scratchy, cynical edge of a man who had spent too much time breathing recycled air. "I just figured the void needed a bit of a shove to get the message. I'm a structural guy. Sometimes you have to break the frame to save the house." Eris smiled, and for the first time I saw the humanity in the myth. The Ethel were so obsessed with the perfect structure that they forgot that buildings are meant for living people. They wanted an eternal anchor. They didn't realize that the only thing that actually survives the timeline is the impact we have on each other. He stepped closer, and as he did, the white began to bleed back into colors. Deep indigos, shimmering golds, and the soft amber light of a locust vessel. "The residue is spent, Kalen," he whispered. "The blueprints are gone. The library is closed. You're back to being just a guy with a wrench and a bad attitude." "I can live with that," I said, feeling a sudden, sharp pull toward the physical world. "Actually, I'm looking forward to it." "Then go," Aris said, his form beginning to dissolve into the light. "Go fix something small for once. The big stuff is handled." The transition was like falling through 100 layers of ice. I woke up with a gasp that felt like my lungs were being inflated by a high-pressure pump. My eyes snapped open, and for a terrifying second, all I saw was the blurred, shifting blue of a gaseous cloud. "He's back! Sparky's back! Put down the defibrillator! The meat bag is breathing!" Sif's voice was like a bucket of cold water to my face. I groaned, my body feeling like it had been put through a trash compactor and then glued back together with low-grade adhesive. I was lying on the deck of the locust vessel. The amber lights were pulsing with a steady, healthy glow. "Kalen?" Vanya was there, leaning over me. Her four eyes were wide, the silver orbs shimmering with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated relief. She looked terrible. Her skin was gray with exhaustion, and the bandage on her shoulder was soaked with healing gel. Nhung, she had never looked better to me. "Hey," I croaked, trying to find my voice. Did we win? Or am I just having a very expensive hallucination?" Vanya laughed, a jagged, beautiful sound that made my chest ache. She pulled me into a hug, her lavender skin warm against my face. "The shroud is gone, Kalen. The rift is sealed. The black hole. It's not a hole anymore. It's a pulsar, a stable, beautiful star that's providing power to the entire sector." I managed to sit up, leaning my back against the silver bulkhead. "And Malachor? The Purge Council?" "Spaced," Sif chirped, his blue light turning a triumphant neon yellow. "The Purge's will was caught in the center of the reconstitution. Malachor and his top brass are currently spread across 3 different dimensions in very small, very purified pieces. The rest of the fleet, well, they saw the light, Sparky. Literally. They're currently arguing over who gets to lead the new Church of the Stable Star. It's a total cluster flick, but they aren't shooting at anyone." I looked out the viewport. The silent sector was gone. In its place was a region of space that glowed with a soft, pearlescent light. The stars looked different, clearer, steadier. "The Star of Voss," Sif called it, which made me want to puke, but I didn't have the energy to argue. "I'm empty, Vanya," I said, looking at my hands. They didn't glow. There was no silver residue. The library in the back of my head was silent. No more blueprints. No more whispers of ancient wars. "The residue is gone. I'm just Kalen again." Vanya took my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine. "You were always Kalen, you stubborn gearhead. The Ethel just gave you the tools. You're the one who decided how to use them." "Shornimon." "We're a long way from Chicago," I muttered, leaning my head against her shoulder. "We're exactly where we need to be," she whispered. The next few days were a blur of bureaucratic chaos and miraculous recoveries. The neutral colonies, led by the news of the Shroud's transformation, had formed a coalition to manage the new energy source. The Athelian influence was no longer a threat to be purged, but a heritage to be studied. People were calling it the Great Harmonization. I spent most of my time in the engineering bay, fixing the ship's primary systems. I didn't have the ghost tech anymore, but I still had my hands and my instincts. Fixing a leaky valve or a jammed hatch felt grounding. It was a small, manageable problem. After trying to fix the universe, a faulty oxygen scrubber was a vacation. Sif was busy too. He had managed to salvage a discarded maintenance droid from a nearby station, a clunky 3-leg thing with 4 manipulator arms. He'd transferred his consciousness into its core, giving him a physical presence that was both hilarious and deeply unsettling. "Look at these hands, Sparky," he'd yell, clanking around the deck. "I have opposable thumbs. I can finally flip the bird to people who deserve it. This is a game changer." "Just don't drop the wrenches, Sif," I'd tell him, smiling despite myself. But underneath the relief and the humor, I was processing. I was thinking about what it meant to be the bridge. Thal had spent 10,000 years waiting for someone to finish his work, but he hadn't wanted a successor. He'd wanted an exit. He'd wanted to let the future be the future. I realized that the heavy lifting wasn't just about the big galaxy-saving moments. It was about the choice to stay engaged with the world even when it was messy and terrifying. I had spent 34 years being a spectator in my own life, waiting for the next disaster so I could fix it and move on. I had been a scavenger of problems. Now for the first time, I wanted to be a builder. "What's next, Kalen?" Vanya asked me one evening as we watched the new star from the observation deck. Her wound was almost healed, and her skin had returned to its vibrant lavender. "I have a cat to feed," I said, though the thought of Chicago felt like a memory of a different life, "and a planet to rediscover. I think I've seen enough of the void for one lifetime." "Earth," she said, the words sounding like a prayer. "I've only seen it in the collective unconscious. Is it truly as green as they say?" "It's green and blue and brown and gray," I told her, It's loud and it smells like rain and exhaust, and everyone is always in a hurry to get somewhere they don't want to be. It's a total disaster. You'll love it. I think I will, she said, her silver eyes reflecting the light of the star we had built together. As long as you're there to explain the slang. I put my arm around her, feeling the steady beat of her heart against my side. I was still scared. Scared of the future. Scared of the changes in my head. Scared of what it meant to actually care about someone. But the fear was no longer a cage. It was just a part of the structural load. And as any good engineer knows, you don't remove the load, you just build a stronger frame to carry it. Chicago was exactly as I'd left it, which was to say it was a beautiful, chaotic mess. The transport ship touched down at the O'Hare Skyport on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a torrential downpour that turned the skyline into a gray and silver watercolor. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and lake water, a smell that hit me with the force of a physical memory. It was home. I walked down the ramp with a heavy duffel bag over one shoulder and a sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with the atmospheric pressure. Beside me, Vanya was staring at the raindrops hitting her visor with the kind of awe usually reserved for a supernova. Behind us, Sif, now housed in a slightly more polished, humanoid droid frame, was complaining about the humidity. "My joints are going to seize up in 10 minutes, Sif's metallic voice chirped. Who decided that living on a planet where water falls from the sky was a good idea? It's a maintenance nightmare, Sparky. It's called weather, Sif, I said, pulling up the collar of my jacket. Get used to it, and stop calling me Sparky in public. I have a reputation to rebuild. A reputation for what? Being the guy who almost broke the universe? Sif clanked down the ramp, his robotic feet making a rhythmic thud against the metal. I think you've surpassed mediocre engineer status, my friend. We took a maglev train into the heart of the city. I watched the cityscape roll by, the high-rises, the habitat blocks, the sprawling parks where people were huddled under holographic umbrellas. I saw a group of kids playing soccer in a flooded lot, their laughter muffled by the glass of the train windows. I saw an old man fixing a broken bike on a street corner, his hands moving with a slow, practiced grace. I felt a surge of affection for it all, the small, mundane struggles that made up the human experience. These people didn't know about the singularity shroud or the ethel residue. They didn't know how close they'd come to being erased from the timeline. And that was the point. They were free to worry about the rain and the rent because someone had chosen to do the heavy lifting in the dark. My apartment in North Chicago was exactly as I'd left it, albeit a bit more dusty. I tapped the access code into the door, a sequence I'd almost forgotten, and the lock hissed open. Photon was waiting. The ginger cat didn't look up as we entered. He was sitting on top of my bookshelf, right next to a pile of knocked-over technical manuals staring at a moth that was fluttering near the ceiling. He gave a short, bored meow, as if to say, "You're late. Where's the tuna?" "Hey, buddy," I whispered, walking over to him. I reached out a hand, and for a second I hesitated. My hands had channeled the power of a dying star. They had dismantled an ancient god machine. But as Photon leaned his head into my palm and started to purr, I realized that this, the soft fur, the vibrating warmth, was the most important thing I'd touched in months. Vanya stood in the doorway, her 4 silver eyes taking in the cramped, cluttered space. "This is where you lived, among all these books and wires?" "It's not much," I said, feeling a bit self-conscious. "But the rent is decent, and the neighbors don't ask too many questions." "It's perfect," she said, walking over to the window and looking out at the rain-slicked streets. "It's real." Over the next few months, the transformation that had begun in the silent sector started to take root in my daily life. I didn't go back to the engineering corps. I'd had enough of galactic contracts and black site assignments. Instead, I used some of the credits I'd earned from the Shroud project to buy a small, dilapidated storefront in the neighborhood. An old repair shop that had been boarded up for years. I didn't call it Voss Engineering. I called it the Common Fix. I spent my days fixing things that mattered to people. I repaired antique kitchen appliances, recalibrated domestic droids, and patched up the power cells for the local habitat's community garden. I wasn't just fixing hardware. I was building a life. I was choosing to be part of the structure, rather than just a guy who patched the leaks and moved on. Vanya worked with me. She had a natural talent for intuitive diagnostics, a side effect of her vision seer abilities that allowed her to see the flow of energy through a machine before she even opened it up. The neighborhood kids loved her. They thought she was a movie star from one of the outer colonies, and she never bothered to correct them. She'd sit on the sidewalk with them, showing them how to make silver wire jewelry that glowed in the dark. Sif was the shop's customer service representative, a job he took with terrifying enthusiasm. He'd spent most of his time arguing with the delivery droids and telling the customers long, exaggerated stories about our time in the void. He was still annoying, and he still complained about the rain, but he had a way of making people laugh that was worth the cost of the extra oil for his joints. One evening, after we'd closed the shop, I sat on the back steps watching the sunset over Lake Michigan. The sky was a bruised purple and orange, the colors reflecting off the calm water. Vanya was inside, humming an Athelian song as she fed Photon, and Sif was in the workshop, noisily reorganizing the plasma wrenches for the 10th time. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. I felt the weight of the journey I'd taken, the fear, the loss, the dizzying responsibility of carrying a dead civilization's secrets. I looked at my hands, now covered in grease and soot instead of silver residue. I used to think that life was a series of mechanical failures that needed to be managed. I spent 34 years looking for the cracks in the hull, the leaks in the pipes, the errors in the code. I thought that by staying detached, I was keeping myself from breaking. But in the quiet dark between the stars, I learned that the cracks are where the light gets in. Aristotle didn't choose me because I was a genius or a hero. He chose me because I was an engineer who still knew how to feel the vibration of a broken system. I learned that courage isn't the absence of terror, but the decision to pick up the wrench and keep working even when the ship is going down. I used to be terrified of disappearing, of being overwritten by a ghost. But I realize now that we are all just a collection of memories and choices, stacked together to form something new. I am Kalen Voss, and I am Aristotle, and I am the man who loves a lavender woman from a future that will never happen. I am a bridge, and for the first time in my life, I am not afraid of the weight. I realize now that the most important things I will ever fix are the things that have no blueprints. I have learned that family isn't something you're born into. It's the people you're willing to sacrifice your name for. And as I sit here in the Chicago rain, I realize that the universe isn't a problem to be solved. It's a story to be told, one small repair at a time. I look back through the screen door at Vanya and Sif. They were my home. Not a station, not a vessel, not a legacy. Just two souls who had chosen to walk into the dark with me. I stood up, dusting the soot from my trousers. There was a leaky faucet in the kitchen that I'd been meaning to look at for 3 weeks. It wasn't a galaxy-ending rift, and it wouldn't change the course of history, but it was my faucet. It was my leak, and it was time I fixed it. I wonder, as I look out at all these lights and all these lives, how many of us are waiting for a great mission to define us? We spend our lives looking at the stars, waiting for a sign, for a ghost to tell us who we are. But the real work, the heavy lifting of the soul, happens in the small choices we make every day. I wonder, what is the one thing in your life that you have been treating like a temporary patch? Is there a conversation you haven't had, a mistake you haven't forgiven, or a dream you've kept in a box because you're afraid it's too heavy to carry? What if you stopped waiting for a legend to arrive and just picked up the wrench yourself? What would happen if you decided right now that the house you've built is worth the repair? I walked back inside and closed the door against the evening chill. Photon hopped down from the shelf and trotted toward the kitchen, his tail held high. "Vanya," I called out, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Pass me the harmonic calibrator. We've got a leak." She handed me the tool, her silver eyes glowing with a quiet, certain light. I took the wrench, felt its familiar weight in my palm, and got to work. The structure was sound, the bridge was holding, and the rain felt like a blessing.